For more than 15 years, a woman was murdered in Southern California, and nobody knew who had killed her. The case went cold. Not even a conviction. Nothing. And during all those years, the man investigators would eventually identify as her killer was working as a middle school teacher. He was showing up to work, teaching children, going home, living a completely ordinary life. And nobody at the school knew what investigators would eventually find. His name was Charles Wright. In April of 2005, 21-year-old Bertina Epps was found dead in a carport in Gardena, California. A resident discovered her body while backing out of one of the parking spaces. She had been strangled. Investigators worked the case, but eventually the leads ran out. And like so many unsolved murders, the case just stopped. Years passed. And while that case sat unsolved, Charles Wright was building a completely different life. He had been working for the Inglewood Unified School District since 1999. He eventually became a middle school teacher. To the people around him, he wasn't known as a murderer. He was a teacher, a guy who showed up to school, worked with students, went home. Nothing about his public life seemed connected to a murder that had happened years earlier. And that's what makes this case so disturbing, because the murder wasn't solved while he was hiding somewhere. It was solved while he was living an ordinary life. For years, there was nothing. Then, in 2021, investigators reopened the old murder. They took evidence from the original crime scene and submitted it for testing again. Technology had changed. Testing methods had improved. So investigators tried again. And this time, the evidence gave them a name. Charles Wright. DNA and fingerprint evidence connected him to the crime scene. In January of 2022, Wright was arrested. And suddenly, the nearly 17-year-old murder wasn't unsolved anymore. There was a suspect, and that suspect was a middle school teacher. But Wright denied killing Bertina Epps. When questioned by the Los Angeles Times, he said he didn't do it. He explained that his fingerprints could have ended up on Epps' purse because he had been selling purses, shoes, and clothes from the trunk of his car around the time of the killing. He didn't explain away the DNA evidence, but he maintained his innocence. Meanwhile, the school district learned about the accusation, and Wright resigned from his teaching position. That alone would have been disturbing enough. A teacher being arrested in connection with a nearly 2-decade-old murder. But investigators weren't finished. After Wright's first arrest, they connected him to another case. This one was from 2006. An 18-year-old woman had been kidnapped and sexually assaulted. And investigators said DNA evidence linked Wright to that crime too. At that point, this wasn't just an old murder investigation anymore. Investigators were looking at a man who had spent years working around children, while allegedly hiding a much darker past, and they started wondering whether there could be other victims. Wright eventually went to trial. In July of 2024, a jury found him guilty of first-degree murder in Bertina Epps' death. He was also convicted in the 2006 kidnapping and sexual assault case. Prosecutors expected him to receive a sentence of 50 years to life in prison. But he never made it to sentencing. About a month before his scheduled sentencing, Charles Wright died in custody. He was 59 years old. And that's where this story ends. Not with some dramatic confession. Not with investigators discovering a secret room beneath a school. Just a DNA match. Evidence that had been sitting there for years. And a teacher who had apparently managed to live a completely ordinary life while a murder remained unsolved. That's probably the part that sticks with me. Because when people imagine a murderer, they usually imagine someone who looks dangerous. Someone who acts strange. Someone everybody around them is suspicious of. Charles Wright had spent years being something much more ordinary. A teacher. And according to the evidence that eventually led to his conviction, that ordinary life had been hiding something very, very dark. The first time I realized someone from my school had been watching me outside my bedroom window, I was sitting on my bed doing homework. I remember that part very clearly. It was late. Not ridiculously late, maybe around 10 at night, but late enough that my parents had already gone to bed and the whole house was quiet. I had my headphones on. I was trying to finish an assignment before going to sleep. Then my phone buzzed. I looked down. It was a message from an account I didn't recognize. The profile picture was mine. At first, I thought it was some stupid fake account. People at school did things like that all the time. Fake profiles, inside jokes, people pretending to be someone else. So I almost ignored it. Then I opened the message. There was a picture attached. I stared at it for a few seconds because I didn't recognize the picture. And then I realized what I was looking at. It was me, sitting on my bed, wearing the same clothes I was wearing right then. The picture had been taken through my bedroom window. I didn't know who took it. I didn't know when they took it. And at that point, I didn't even know if the person who sent it was standing outside my house. I just knew one thing. Someone had been watching me. And somehow, they wanted me to know. This happened when I was in 8th grade. I was new to the school that year, and honestly, I was pretty nervous about it. It was a big public school near where I lived, and I didn't really know anybody. I wasn't one of those people who could walk into a new place and immediately start talking to everyone. I was quiet. I kept mostly to myself. So when one of my teachers assigned me a seat beside a boy named Dan, I was actually kind of relieved. He seemed friendly. He was talkative. He asked me my name, how old I was, where I was from, what classes I liked. Normal stuff. Nothing about him immediately seemed dangerous. If anything, I remember thinking he was probably going to make school easier for me. For the first few days, that's exactly how it was. We talked during class. He made jokes. Sometimes we'd talk before the teacher came in. He seemed like one of those people who could talk to absolutely anyone. I didn't really have a problem with him. Then, after a couple of weeks, I started noticing little things. Not scary things, just weird things. He wanted to know where I lived. He asked which way I walked home. He asked what time I usually got out of school. I didn't think much of it. When you're that age, you don't necessarily think about why somebody is asking those questions. You just answer, and I didn't want to be rude. So I answered. Looking back, that was probably the first mistake. Over the next couple of months, Dan started trying to get closer to me. He'd find reasons to sit near me. He'd wait for me between classes. If I was talking to somebody else, he'd sometimes just show up. Again, none of this was enough for me to think, this person is dangerous. It was more like, he's kind of annoying. And honestly, I think that's important. Because creepy people don't always look creepy. Sometimes they're just a person sitting beside you in math class. Sometimes they're the person making jokes while you're waiting for the teacher. Sometimes there's somebody you never would have thought twice about. That's what made what happened later so difficult for me to understand. Because I kept thinking back to that first day, the first time I met him, and I kept wondering how I hadn't noticed anything. Eventually, one of my friends, John, got assigned to sit with us. So suddenly I was sitting between John and Dan. John and Dan actually got along pretty well. They started talking more. I didn't really care. I was happy to have another person around. Then the school announced that they wanted to talk to Dan about something. I never found out exactly what it was. He didn't show up to class the next day, then the day after that. Eventually, we heard that he'd left school. Apparently, he had started working at a convenience store nearby. I remember thinking that was weird, but honestly, I was relieved. I didn't realize how relieved until he was gone. School felt easier. I wasn't constantly wondering where he was. I wasn't dealing with him trying to get my attention. I could just go to class and go home. For a while, I thought that was the end of it. It wasn't. A few weeks later, I got a message from an account using Dan's name. I didn't answer. Then another message came through. I opened it. The profile picture was me, not a picture I had posted publicly. It was a picture someone had taken of me at school. I remember feeling annoyed more than scared. I thought maybe he was trying to mess with me, so I blocked the account. That should have been it. Except another account appeared. Different username, different profile picture. Same thing. It was using pictures of me. I blocked that one too. At that point, my mom knew something was going on. I told her about the accounts. She wasn't happy. But because Dan wasn't in my school anymore, we didn't really know what to do. I figured blocking him would eventually make him stop. And for a little while, it did. There were no more messages. No more fake accounts. Nothing. I started forgetting about it, which is why the next message hit me so hard. It came on an ordinary night. I was sitting on my bed, doing homework. My headphones were in. My bedroom window was behind me. I wasn't thinking about Dan at all. Then my phone buzzed. The account was new. No profile picture. No name I recognized. Just a message. I opened it. There was an image attached. At first, I didn't understand what I was looking at. Then I recognized my bedroom, my bed, my desk, my window, and me. I just stared at the screen. I remember looking around my room. Everything was exactly where it was supposed to be. My curtains were open. The light from my desk lamp was on. And outside the window, it was dark. I got off the bed. Slowly, I walked toward the window. I didn't want to look outside. I really didn't. But eventually I did. Nothing. Just the backyard. Trees. Darkness. I couldn't see anybody. I checked the locks. They were locked. Then I checked the other windows. All locked. I went downstairs and woke my mom. I showed her the picture. She immediately told me to block the account. Again. So I did. But this time, blocking it didn't make me feel better. Because now I knew something. Dan didn't need to be inside the school to know what I was doing. He didn't even need to talk to me. He could just watch. And I started thinking about all the questions he'd asked me months earlier. Where I lived, what time I got home, which way I walked, who I lived with. At the time, it seemed like random questions. Now they didn't. Now every single one of them felt different. I started changing my routine. I stopped walking home the same way. I stopped sitting near the same windows. I kept my curtains closed. I didn't tell people exactly why. I was embarrassed. I also didn't want everyone at school talking about me. But the worst part was that I still had no idea if he was actually outside my house. There was no proof, just a photograph. And that photograph was enough. A few days later, I saw him. I was leaving school with John. We were walking toward the road near the school when I noticed someone standing across the street. It was Dan. I froze. John looked at me. What? I didn't answer. I just pointed. Dan was looking directly at us. He didn't wave. He didn't smile. He just stood there, watching. Then a car pulled up beside him. He got inside and left. I remember John asking me, "Was that him?" I nodded. "Yeah." He looked at me. "Are you sure?" I said, "Yeah." And that was the first time I realized this wasn't something I could handle by myself. I told my mom everything. The messages, the fake accounts, the photograph, seeing him outside school. This time, she took it seriously. We contacted the school. We told them what had happened. I don't remember exactly what they did afterward. What I remember is that I stopped feeling like I was imagining things. Other people knew. My mom knew. The school knew. John knew. And for the first time, I felt like I wasn't completely alone in it. But I still had one question. The picture. Who took it? Because I'd spent days looking at that photograph, and there was something about it that bothered me. The angle. It wasn't taken from far away. It looked like whoever took it had been standing fairly close to the window. Close enough to see directly into my room. Close enough to know exactly where I was sitting. And when I looked at the background of the picture, I noticed something I hadn't noticed before. The window was open. I had always kept my bedroom window slightly open at night. Just a little. I liked having fresh air. My parents knew. It was normal. But suddenly I couldn't stop thinking about it. If someone had been standing outside that window, they would have been able to hear me. They would have been able to see me. And if they had wanted to, they could have reached the window. I don't know if Dan ever actually came onto our property. I don't know how many times he watched me. I don't know how long he'd been taking pictures. And that's probably the part that bothers me most. Because when I think back to those first few months, I remember all the times I sat at that window, doing homework, listening to music, talking to friends, thinking I was completely alone. I wasn't. And to this day, whenever I'm sitting near a window at night, I still catch myself looking outside, just for a second, just to make sure there's nobody standing there. Because once you realize someone can be watching you without you knowing, it's really hard to ever feel completely alone again. I used to think the hardest part about going to school was dealing with people you didn't like. I was wrong. The hardest part was realizing there was one person I couldn't get away from. He wasn't a stranger. He wasn't some random guy outside the school. He was someone I knew, someone I dated, and for a while, I had to see him almost every single day. It started pretty normally. I was 16 at the time, and I went to a pretty large high school. There were thousands of students, so it wasn't unusual to see the same people in the hallways all day. I was dating a guy I'll call Ryan. At first, things were good. We'd been together for a few months. We had the same friends. We ate lunch together. We'd walk around school between classes. Nothing about the relationship seemed particularly strange. Then we broke up. It wasn't some huge dramatic breakup. At least, that's how I saw it. I just didn't want to be in a relationship anymore. I told him that. He didn't take it well. At first, he kept asking me to reconsider. I'd say no. He'd ask again. I'd say no. Eventually, I stopped responding. That's when things changed. The first time I noticed him waiting outside one of my classrooms, I honestly thought it was a coincidence. My English class ended at 10:20. I walked into the hallway and saw him leaning against the wall across from the door. He looked at me. I looked at him. Neither of us said anything. I kept walking. I figured maybe he was waiting for a friend. That was the explanation I gave myself. The next day, he was there again. Same hallway, same spot. I remember thinking, okay, that's a little weird, but it still wasn't enough to scare me. Then I noticed something. He wasn't supposed to be in that hallway. His next class was on the other side of the building. I'd known his schedule, and I knew mine, so I started paying attention. The next day, I left English. He was there. The day after that, there again, then again. Every time my class ended, he was somewhere nearby. Sometimes he'd be standing by the lockers. Sometimes he'd be walking down the hall. Once, he was sitting on a bench directly outside the classroom. He wasn't doing anything. That was the weird part. He'd just be there, watching me walk past. Eventually, I told one of my friends. She thought I was overthinking it. She said, maybe he's just trying to talk to you. I told her I didn't want him to. She understood. So the next day, she walked with me between classes. When we left English, Ryan was there again. My friend looked at him, then looked at me. She didn't say anything, but I could tell she finally understood what I meant, because it wasn't random anymore. He was waiting for me. A few days later, he started showing up outside my other classes. That was when I got uncomfortable. English wasn't the only place. He'd be outside math, then science, then the cafeteria, then near the front entrance. It felt like every time I turned a corner, he was there. And every time I saw him, he'd act completely normal. Sometimes he'd smile. Sometimes he'd ask how I was doing. Once he said, "You've been avoiding me." I remember stopping. I said, "Yes." He laughed, like I made a joke. Then he said, "I know." I didn't know what to say to that, so I walked away. After that, I started changing my routine. I'd take different hallways. I'd leave class a little early when I could. I'd wait for crowds before walking through certain parts of the school. It helped for a few days. Then he started showing up in those places too. That was when I realized he wasn't just randomly running into me. He was figuring out where I would be. One afternoon, I stayed late for a school activity. Most of the building had emptied out. When I finished, I walked toward the front entrance. I saw Ryan standing near the doors. There were barely any students left. I stopped. He looked at me. Then he smiled. "Hey." I didn't answer. I turned around and walked back toward the office. He followed. Not close. Just close enough that I could hear his footsteps. I started walking faster. So did he. I turned into the office. He stopped. A teacher saw me. She asked if everything was okay. I said yes. I don't know why. I should have told her. Instead, I just waited until Ryan walked away. That night, I told my parents. They contacted the school. The school said they would look into it. For a little while, things seemed better. I didn't see him as often. I thought maybe somebody had spoken to him. Maybe he'd finally realized he needed to leave me alone. Then, one morning, I walked into school and saw him standing outside the main office. He wasn't looking at me. He was looking at the doors, like he was waiting for someone. I walked past. Then he said my name. I kept walking. He said it again, louder. I turned around. He looked completely calm. Then he said, "I just want to talk." I said, "I don't." He smiled. "Okay." Then he walked away. That should have made me feel better. Instead, it made me more nervous. Because he didn't argue. He didn't get angry. He just accepted the answer. Like he knew he'd get another chance. A few days later, I found out he'd been suspended. I remember feeling relieved. Finally, I thought it was over. But that afternoon, when I got out of school, I saw him across the street. He wasn't supposed to be there. I knew that. He stood beside a car, watching the students leave. I stopped walking. He saw me. For a few seconds, neither of us moved. Then he got into the car and drove away. That was the moment I finally understood something. The school wasn't what was keeping him around me. The school was just giving him a schedule. He knew when I arrived. He knew when my classes ended. He knew where I usually walked. And even when he wasn't allowed inside, he could still wait outside. After that, my parents started driving me to school. A teacher walked me to my car after class. My friends stopped letting me walk alone. Eventually, things calmed down. Ryan stopped showing up. I graduated. I moved on. But there's one thing I still think about. For months, I've been telling myself, maybe I'm imagining it. Maybe I'm being dramatic. Maybe he's just there by coincidence. And every time I did that, I ignored another little piece of evidence. That's what scares me when I think about it now. Not that he followed me. Not that he waited outside my classes. It's that he managed to make me question my own instincts while he was doing it. Because I think, deep down, I knew something was wrong long before I was willing to admit it. I noticed the man because he was always sitting in the same car. Every afternoon, when school let out, he'd be there. Same parking lot, same spot, same dark-colored car. At first, I didn't think anything of it. There are always parents waiting outside schools, people picking up their kids, older brothers and sisters, teachers, delivery drivers, whatever. So seeing a stranger sitting in a car wasn't exactly unusual. The weird part was that I started noticing him even when I wasn't looking for him. I'd walk out of the school. I'd glance toward the parking lot, and there he'd be, just sitting there. I was 15 when this happened. I went to a private school in a fairly quiet area, and most days were pretty routine. My parents dropped me off in the morning. I went to class, hung out with friends. Then I'd either take the bus home or get picked up. Nothing exciting. I wasn't someone who got into trouble. I wasn't constantly out doing things. Most of my life was basically school, home, homework, repeat. That's probably why the man stood out to me. He was the only thing that didn't fit into the routine. The first time I saw him, I was waiting for my mom. I was standing near the front entrance with a couple of friends. It was around 3:30. Most of the students had already left. I remember looking across the parking lot and seeing a dark sedan parked near the road. There was a man inside. He wasn't doing anything, just sitting there. I didn't even really think about it. Then my mom arrived. I got into the car. We drove home, and that was it. At least that's what I thought. The next afternoon, he was there again. Same car, same spot. I noticed him because I recognized the vehicle. I remember thinking, that's weird. Then I forgot about it. The third day, he was there. Fourth day, there again. After about a week, I started mentioning him to my friend. I said, "Do you ever notice that guy?" She looked over. "What guy?" I pointed toward the parking lot. The car was there. She shrugged. Probably someone's dad. Maybe. That explanation made sense. So I left it alone. For the next couple of weeks, the man became part of the background. I didn't know his name. I didn't know why he was there. I didn't even know if he was actually watching anyone. But every afternoon, he'd be sitting in that car. Sometimes he'd be there when school was busy. Sometimes he'd still be there when almost everyone had gone home. And that's when I started noticing something. He wasn't always facing the school. Sometimes he was facing the road. Sometimes he was looking at the students. And sometimes he was looking directly at me. The first time our eyes met, I looked away. I didn't want to make it weird. Maybe I'd imagined it. Maybe he wasn't looking at me at all. But the next day, it happened again. I walked outside. He looked at me. I looked back. He didn't look away. He just stared. I remember feeling this really uncomfortable sensation in my stomach. Not fear. Not yet. More like, why are you looking at me? I told myself he probably wasn't. I went home. The next day, I took the bus instead of waiting outside. I figured I'd avoid the whole thing. When the bus pulled away, I looked out the window. The car was still there. After that, I started telling my parents. My dad wasn't particularly worried. He said, he's probably waiting for somebody. That made sense. My mom agreed. And honestly, what were we supposed to do? Call the police because a man was sitting in a car? There was no crime. He hadn't approached me. He hadn't threatened me. He hadn't done anything. He was just sitting there. So I tried to forget about him. Then one afternoon, something changed. I was leaving school with my friend when she suddenly grabbed my arm. Wait, I stopped. What? She pointed across the parking lot. The man was outside his car. He wasn't sitting down anymore. He was standing beside it, and he was looking at us. My friend whispered, "Is that the guy?" I nodded. He started walking toward the school entrance. Not toward us, just toward the building. We watched him walk inside. That immediately felt wrong. He wasn't wearing a school badge. He wasn't dressed like a teacher, and I'd never seen him inside before. My friend said, maybe he's picking someone up. Again, possible. So we went inside. About 10 minutes later, I saw him again. He was standing near one of the hallways. I remember feeling my stomach drop, because he wasn't supposed to be there. I grabbed my friend's arm. Let's go. We turned around. The man started walking in our direction. We went straight to the office. I told the teacher what had happened. She looked concerned. Then she asked me something I wasn't expecting. What's his name? I said I didn't know. She asked what he looked like. I described him. She immediately picked up the phone. That's when I knew this wasn't the first time they heard about him. She didn't look confused. She looked worried. A few minutes later, another staff member came in. They asked me to wait in the office. Then the principal came in. He asked me if I'd seen the man before. I said yes. He sits outside almost every day. The principal looked at the teacher. They exchanged a glance. Then he told me something I didn't fully understand at the time. The man wasn't supposed to be near the school. There had apparently been a legal restriction preventing him from being within a certain distance of the school. I remember just staring at him. I said, "So why was he here?" The principal didn't answer. He just told me that the police had been contacted. A few minutes later, I saw police cars outside. The man was still in the parking lot. He wasn't running. He wasn't trying to hide. He was just sitting in his car, like he'd done every other afternoon. The police approached him. He got out. They spoke for a few minutes. Then they arrested him. I watched from inside the school. And I remember thinking about all the afternoons I'd seen him sitting there. All those times I'd looked toward the parking lot. All those times I'd wondered who he was waiting for. Later, my parents explained more of what had happened. The man had restrictions that prohibited him from being near schools. And somehow, he'd been showing up anyway. That was the part that really got to me. Because I'd spent weeks telling myself there was probably a normal explanation. He was someone's dad. He was waiting for somebody. Maybe he worked nearby. Maybe I was imagining him staring at me. But there had been a reason he wasn't supposed to be there. And I had no idea. For a while afterward, I became paranoid about cars. Anytime I saw a vehicle parked outside the school, I'd look twice. If someone sat in a car for too long, I'd notice. If somebody followed the bus for a few blocks, I'd notice. I knew most of it was probably nothing. But once you've learned that someone can sit outside a place every day without anybody immediately realizing why they're there, you start paying attention. The thing I remember most happened a few days after the arrest. I was leaving school with my mom. We were walking toward the car, and I saw another vehicle parked across the street. For half a second, I thought it was his car. My heart dropped. Then I looked again. It wasn't. Just some random person waiting in their car. My mom noticed me staring. She asked, "What is it?" I shook my head. Nothing. And that's when I realized how much the whole thing had gotten into my head. Because there was nothing unusual about that car. Nothing at all. But I couldn't stop thinking about the other one. The one that had been there day after day. The one I'd gotten so used to seeing that I'd stopped wondering why. I think that's what scares me about the whole thing. Not the arrest. Not even the fact that the man had been breaking restrictions. It's how normal he looked. How ordinary the situation seemed. A car in a school parking lot. A person waiting outside. Nothing obviously threatening. And if nobody had finally recognized what was happening, he could have kept sitting there every afternoon, watching students leave, and nobody would have known why. Even now, when I see someone sitting alone in a parked car outside of school, I notice. I don't automatically assume they're dangerous. I don't think every stranger is watching me, but I pay attention because sometimes the scariest people aren't the ones who look threatening. Sometimes they're the ones who look completely normal until you find out why they were there. Subscribe and like if you want more content like this, and send me any stories that happened to you or your friends. Peace.